Thank you for coming this afternoon. I know we're competing with other things scheduled for the SLA Alumni Weekend activities, but it's nice to have you here. I put together a PowerPoint slideshow with some of the highlights of our earlier history. There's so much history in this town and in this school and in the Seventh-day Adventist community in the area. It's hard to get everything into a slideshow, let me tell you. I had to pick and choose. I'd have you here till 2 a.m. with all kinds of goodies, but I tried to hit some of the highlights so we can kind of have a whirlwind tour. As you know, this is the 140th anniversary for South Lancaster Academy. We are one of the oldest Seventh-day Adventist educational institutions in the world, and we are the only one that's still within our immediate locale. We started off with SLA in 1884, just up the street and around the corner in Elder Haskell's carriage house, which was converted into a church building for a short while, and then into the school in 1882. 1883, they actually incorporated the name South Lancaster Academy. But the first classes were in April 19, 1882. And shortly after that, they built their permanent home. So the permanent home that they built in 1884 is still standing, but it's part of the former campus of Atlantic Union College right next door. It's a shame it's not part of South Lancaster Academy again, because that was the oldest school building that was built specifically for the school. But without any extra sideshows, let me proceed here. I'd like to start with a word of prayer. We're a Christian school. So let's bow our heads for a moment, please. Dear loving Lord, we thank you for this Sabbath afternoon that we can come together and ponder and consider the early origins of our school and the many blessings throughout the years you have provided to those who have been here and involved with South Lancaster Academy. Help me to do a good job, Lord, to hit some of the highlights. May it be interesting and inspiring for those of us today to continue the living legacy of Christian education here at South Lancaster Academy. We pray and ask in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, on the slideshow here that I put together, we have a nice quote I'd like to start off with from the Bible, Isaiah 46:9. Remember the former things long past, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me. So God wants us to remember, doesn't he? Here we have the very first school group on that very special day, April 19, 1882. And the building behind them is the carriage house I mentioned that had been fashioned into a school building at this point. And it was standing approximately where the parking lot is now for the village church. That's where it was for the first day. This poor building sadly was torn down back in 1996 when they raised a series of wooden buildings along Prescott Street where it had found its longest home, and they were making way for parking for the new dining commons at AUC. I was the last person alive in this building. I'll tell you that story maybe a little later. Another quote from the Bible is, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." Matthew 38:19-20. This promise that Jesus gave to his disciples resounded very well in the early Adventist community here in South Lancaster. They took this commission rather seriously, and they wanted to start that school. Lancaster originally was a very rural community. Here's a photo from 1900. Showing the far end of Langan Road, looking off the Bennett Bridge on Route 117. The town pound has been rebuilt several times, but it's still in the same location. If you drive by, you can see it. But we were a very agrarian, rural community back in the 1800s. Here's a nice sweeping view across what's known as one of the intervales. To the left, you can see Thayer Conservatory, the side of the mansion from behind. And up to the right, you can see George Hill, so you have an idea where you are. The lower hill down in between the trees and George Hill is what we call Kilbourne Hill, and that's right across the street from us here at South Lancaster Academy. Very rural farm community. A young minister by the name of John N. Loughborough had converted as a young boy, 12 years old, to the Millerite Adventist movement. His family were Methodists, and they lived up near Rochester, New York, in a small town called Victor. This young man lost his father at an early age, and he stepped up to help with the family quite a bit, with his mother and his siblings. When the family became Millerite Adventists, this young fellow at the age of 12 was going door to door passing out literature, letting people know they believed the Lord would be coming soon. Imagine that, 12 years old, the same age as our academy students and our 8th graders here. So he was assigned to the Northeast around 1865. Moses Howe, another early Adventist pioneer from Michigan, and Elder John N. Loughborough were going throughout New England helping to pull together the small bands of Sabbath-keeping Adventists who were meeting in homes and halls and renting churches. And it was this gentleman that helped organize the company here in Lancaster. There were only 8 members originally in the first Seventh-day Adventist church organized here on April 30th, 1864. And they were organized in the home of Louis and Abigail Randall Priest, who are shown here in these sketches based on early photographs. These I've taken pictures in our Heritage Room collection at the Village Church. Dr. Geraldine Grout, the former Gleaner editor, paid an artist to make these likenesses based on original family photos that had been lent to her. So these two were actually not part of the original group, even though they were organized in their home. They were good old Millerite Adventists, and they didn't believe it was a wise thing to formally organize. It might constitute Babylon, which was not a happy word for the early Millerite Adventists. A couple of years later, though, they saw the wisdom in it, and they too joined the small church that had formed in their living room, in their parlor. Their son, Louis Priest Jr., and his wife, Mary Crandall Priest, were part of the original 8 members from April 30th, 1864. Also, the brother Henry Saunders Priest, and his wife, Nancy Marie Dunham, were part of the original 8, as were also Roxy Rice and her husband Benjamin Rice. Roxy took a leading role a little later in helping to organize some key institutions for the early Adventist church's development. The Vigilant Missionary and Tract Society was formed in 1869, just 5 years after the church had organized. And at that point, the group had moved down here to South Lancaster. They originally were up in North Lancaster in 1864. Anyways, she was one of the key members in the Vigilant Missionary Tract Society, along with Elder Haskell and his wife, first wife, Mary Howe Haskell. And that organization helped pioneer the work for literature evangelism within the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, helping to do Bible correspondence through the mail, writing to people, circulating religious tracts, and praying for people who would mail letters in, asking for special prayer. And it formed the basis of what became our literature evangelistic work in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Started here in South Lancaster. The other 2 members of the original 8 who were amazingly active in the early Adventist Church, especially here in the Northeast, were Elder Haskell and his first wife, Mary Howe Haskell. You may notice, if you can see down at the bottom, the birth and death years, that his first wife, Mary, was 20 years older than him. Very peculiar story there. Elder Haskell's first wife was 20 years his senior. When she died in 1894, he actually proposed to Ellen White, Sister White, whose husband had died in the 1880s, and she politely turned him down. She was very fond of him. In fact, she wrote between herself and Elder Haskell more than any other person save a family member in her lifetime. They had correspondence continually from the early days and friendship. And she felt that it would not be good for her work to have her name changed. She would have had to have changed her name if she married again, and she thought it might be confusing for all of her books and literature to have the name changed. But they remained good friends, and he ended up proposing to a woman 20 years his junior, and Mary and Hetty Hurd. And Hetty was the second wife. And interestingly, Mary ended up getting buried out in either Michigan or California, I'm forgetting where. And his second wife, Hetty, ended up dying and getting buried here in Lancaster. She's at Eastwood Cemetery, not too far from where my folks are. And later in life, Elder Haskell was asked, he says, Elder Haskell, where do you want to be buried? Which wife should we put you next to? Well, he was a very practical man. He didn't miss a stitch. He said, well, whoever I'm closest to, of course. Well, sorry for us, he was closer to Mary when he died, so he's not buried with us. He's buried elsewhere. But the first wife, the interesting story of their marriage goes back to his youth. As a young boy in his late teens, he was working for a farmer over near Oakham, where he was born. And he worked very well for this old man, and he was failing. The old man was getting older. Well, he had an invalid daughter, Mary, who had been a school teacher, but she had come down with what we presume was tuberculosis. And she was bedridden and not doing well. Well, the poor old man was getting worse and worse, and he feared he'd probably expire before his daughter. And he asked the young lad, Haskell, who was working so diligently, keeping the small farm going and tending to their needs, he said, if you would agree to watch my daughter should I die first, I'll leave you this farm. Well, Elder Haskell, being a young man and being conscientious and thoughtful and wanting to be helpful, he agreed to it. Well, the poor man did die, and Elder Haskell found himself in a very strange circumstance of having to care for this woman 20 years older than him that was in her deathbed. And of course he got the farm and all, but he thought it wasn't right to move into that house and live under the same roof with a woman unless they were married. So they got married. She agreed. Well, he took such good care of that Mary that she had a full recovery. And she turned out to be a godsend for him because he only had about a 7th or 8th grade education, and she was a school teacher, so she ended up editing many of his books and sermons and helping him with his grammar and his spelling and many other things, and she became a dynamo here in the South Lancaster community, helping the students especially with tutoring and lending library books. They had a great private library, and many other wonderful stories of her help to her husband and the community here. So these two were definitely strong pioneers. In 1864, the church had formed. By 1868, they had the Vigilant Missionary Tract Society. 1869, under Haskell's tutelage, they organized the first camp meeting here. And it was at that camp meeting that they voted to make him a minister, and they formed the New England Conference and made him the president. So he was quite an upstart, quite an active upstart here. Well, this man was the man with the vision and the enthusiasm to start the school later. He was a very forward-thinking person. In fact, around the same time that he was the president here from 1870 forward, when they formed the New England Conference, it wasn't long after that the folks, the brethren out west, wanted him to be their leader because he was such a dynamo and young and energetic. He was in high demand within the Adventist circles. Well, he hated to say no, but the California brethren were very adamant they'd like to have him out there to help lead the way in the West. He was a Yankee. He didn't want to leave New England, and he didn't feel that his work was done here. So he prayed about it, and he thought about it, and prayed about it some more, and finally he came up with an idea. He told the brethren in California, yes, I'll be your conference president out there too, with one condition. I can continue to be the conference president here in the New England Conference, and I'll divide my time betwixt and between the two. Well, didn't he have a car, a railroad car, fitted for him with a sleeping area and an office, and he would travel back and forth, so many, like 3 months there, 3 months here, 6 months there, 6 months here. And he was very innovative. He was very, very much a Yankee, industrious, didn't want to miss any opportunities, and he started arranging for stops along the way of the railroad line where he would stop and have the brethren prearrange for the tent and the meeting hall or something, and he would do evangelistic series on the way out and back. Very practical man. In fact, when he was away, he couldn't be here to tend to his yard, and so he grew corn right up to the edge of his house. And when they tore that house down in the early 70s by the village church, the old Haskell Cady house, didn't they find between the rafters and between the boards of the walls of the outer and inner wall all kinds of corn cobs the squirrels had squirreled away in there from his cornfield around his house. Anyways, he was quite an amazing man. And so...
You have a hand
Oh, I'm sorry, I've got a hand up. Yes, sir, Mr. Stewart.
John, how long did she live, his first wife, being 20 years older?
Well, she died in her 80s in 1894. And I'm cheating, I can read it on the bottom of this thing. But 1894, she happened to be out on the West Coast with him at that point. And then he remarried several years later to Hetty Hurd. And I think Hetty died in the 30s, and Elder Haskell died in 1922. Amazingly, he and Elder Loughborough, the first official pastor that organized these 8 people into the church, they were some of the longest living Adventist pioneers. When Sister White died in 1915, it was Haskell that gave the sermon and went with her body from California out to Michigan, where she was buried next to her husband, James White, my third cousin 6 times removed. And he lived quite old, and Loughborough lived pretty old. And the other interesting thing about Elder Loughborough, he wrote the first official history of the Adventist Church in 1893. So he was a bit of an historian, too. I'm sure I would have liked to have met him. But anyways, these two were a dynamo here in town. Haskell came to town in 1865. Well, he was here in 1864 when they organized the church, but he surprised everybody, he bought the old Bancroft property in South Lancaster. I mentioned they formed the church up in north end of town along what's now Lunenburg Road. There's a cellar hole there, and my cousin's property, the Denny's, and Heinolds had owned it, but the cellar hole's still there in the field off the road if you know the place to look. And that's where the priest family lived, and they organized the church April 30th in 1864. Well, Elder Haskell decided they needed something a little more permanent, and he bought the Bancroft property and surprised everybody. It was a little quiet deal, but it comprised of the old building right by the edge of Narrow Lane and Main Street, which sadly was torn down about 20 years ago. Now there's condos there. Well, people have no respect. Don't get me onto that one. And it was one of our own Adventists that did it. Greedy people. Anyways, too much said. But the Bancroft house was there. And it stretched basically between Narrow Lane and Prescott Street from Main Street all the way down to Goss Lane. So all of those houses pretty much that were developed along Prescott Street and Goss Lane originally were Adventist-related families that had been coming to the area. And especially when the school got started, people were moving in to be here so their children could attend the school. And so this community got its start. The Adventist roots in South Lancaster were very much due to this gentleman right here. Quite a pioneer. All right, here he is as a young man holding the Bible. This would have been about the time he had joined the Adventist church here, or they formed the Adventist church in 1864. And here's another one a little later in life. And here he is with Hetty, his second wife, in his older age. I think this was taken about 2 years before he died, around 1920. And of course, this is how he looked probably around 1882 when they formed the South Lancaster Academy. This is the village church. So, as I mentioned, the village church was formed in 1864 in the priest family home. A lot of them moved down to South Lancaster. Benjamin Rice, by the way, he had a patent for a machine to make paper bags. They came on down towards Clinton, and South Lancaster, a little more industrious than the rural farmlands in northern Lancaster. And they needed a place for a church. They started using Elder Haskell's carriage house from the Bancroft property, but they got up to about 50 members and outgrew that. So in 1878, they decided to build a permanent church structure. And this is one of the very earliest photos we have of the South Lancaster Adventist Church, now known as the Village Church. And the house next to it is still standing. I believe that was the Harris family. And it was Chapman Harris that helped oversee the building of it, another one of the members of the church. So this church was built in 1878. The carriage house would have been moved over to the right somewhere, not too far. And just 4 years later, it was utilized as the beginning of the South Lancaster Academy School. They did have some classes in the basement level here. Notice there's windows. They had a full basement. So this was a very important part to the Adventist community and still is to this day. It's been added on, though, quite a bit. The first edition went to the right in 1899, the North Hall. 1897. Dr. Kellogg was coming through promoting the evangelism work with medical ministry, and they wanted a larger space for him, and they were already kind of busted to their seams. So they built that North Hall in 1897. 2 years later, believe it or not, in 1899, the General Conference session was held there. The whole General Conference session. Now they have auditoriums and stadiums and have busted out the seams. Back then they crammed them all into the little village church with the 1897 addition. Here we have a view showing that addition to the right. You can see the entrance there to the right. In the 1940s, the next big change was they built to the west a large winged addition. And then the latest addition, and they also in 1967 added a foyer to the front so that you had another space to come in and stairs going upstairs to the balcony. And then in 1987, the most recent addition was built, the Fellowship Hall, which is what we have there today. The 1869 Vigilant Missionary and Tract Society, as I said, started here with this congregation. And by the 1880s, they had their own little building over on Mill Street, not far from where the conference office was. Still, the conference office is still there. It's apartments today, the original New England Conference building. But this is a photo of the New England Tract Repository. And Elder Haskell also had, what's that? It was a place where they had literature evangelism, and they would mail literature and do correspondence Bible studies, and a lot of the early evangelistic work with literature and mail, United States Postal Mail.
Whole building to do that?
Well, that was their office, so they had the secretary there, and it was kind of like the Book and Bible House. It really truly was the birth of what we know as the Adventist book centers today. That was the very first Adventist book center in modern terms. Yes, yes. And so nearby too, behind Elder Haskell's house, which was built not far from where the village church is, he later built his own house there on Sawyer Street. He had in the back a little building built around 1905, and it was the office for the Bible training school that he had started down in New York City. He actually pioneered the work down in New York City for African Americans in the Adventist church. Some of the first Adventist African American congregations were because of his efforts down in New York City. And he also encouraged them to participate, come up to school here later too. So South Lancaster Academy had some of the earliest interracial student body represented. So they were very much ahead of their time with their thinking and their love and passion for sharing the Lord, the message of the Lord and His soon return. These folks here worked in the Bible training school, which was very active, very similar to the repository, but a little bit more on what we would probably call Bible workers. You got the literature evangelists, but you also had the Bible workers that did a lot more personal visits, Bible studies, and they worked hand in hand with literature evangelism in church groups. But this was the start of that work, and he's got quite a basket full of things in those bags. I'm guessing probably tracts and literature and booklets. The woman to the right there, I believe, in the white shirt is Miss Katie. She was Elder Haskell's secretary for years, and when he died in 1922, he left the house to her. And then later when she died, it got left to the village church, and then it sadly got torn down around 1972, I think. It was in bad shape at that point, and they wanted to expand for the parking area. So that's an early picture there of some of the work in town. And of course, in 1882, they started the South Lancaster Academy. By 1884, they realized it was going to actually work, and so they needed a home, they needed a school, and this building here was erected. They called it the Academy Hall. Today we call it Founders Hall, and it served AUC many years until recently, and now sadly it's bare bones, emptied out this summer. Catastrophe, the last year and a half, catastrophe. But the building, thankfully, is still there, and we're prayerful maybe it will be repurposed yet for the Lord's work and saved. This building is the oldest Seventh-day Adventist educational building on the planet, still owned by Adventists until recently used by them. So it has very significant historical and spiritual heritage for our denomination and our community. I would hate to see anything happen to this building. It really deserves a more fitting status than the current mess.
So that was SLA when I was here.
Yep. This served as South Lancaster Academy's building up until that, and also the other buildings that grew into Atlantic Union College up until 1964-65 school year. And at that time, the New England Association of Schools and Colleges had approached the union in 1958, telling them if they wanted the college to continue to be accredited, they would have to separate the secondary level education from the college program and campus. So that was 1958. And the union immediately approached the local conference, Southern New England Conference. Elder Merle Mills was the president. And they said, listen, we've got our hands full with the college. The academies and all the other conferences are run by the conferences. Would you please take over the boarding school for the secondary education program? Because it was under the union umbrella at that point. Well, and the union was formed in 1901. Prior to that, it was New England Conference. And guess what? When the New England Conference was turned into Northern New England and Southern New England, and the Atlantic Union Conference, the parent organization, was formed in 1901, do you think the union had to pay for any of the buildings and things that were handed over to them? No. But now they want money, the greedy people. Anyways, so back to the story at hand. In 1884, this was built. And what's the point? There was another point I was getting to. Now I've lost my spot.
SLA and AUC.
Oh yes, how long they were together. So in 1958, they approached Southern New England Conference. And Southern New England Conference rose to the occasion. They had a special constituency meeting at the camp meeting that summer in 58, and they voted to form 3 committees: a locating committee, a fundraising committee, and I think it was a building committee. And your grandmother, Heidi, was on the locating committee. She told me some of the stories and the prayers that they had and the process of discovering the property in New Braintree and the issue about getting the satisfactory well, and that was an answer to prayers. They did get, finally they got the well they needed to facilitate the large place they were planning to build. So in 1958, they launched what became Pioneer Valley Academy. And that was finally built and opened in the fall of 1965. Now, we had 2 other academies at that time that were full-time: South Lancaster here in South Lancaster, Mass., and Greater Boston Academy, which was down in Newbury Street, still in Boston, right in the thick of the city in a very high-profile area, good shopping area still to this day down Newbury Street. Well, the sanitarium work out there in Stoneham was doing well. The hospital had been expanding, and they allocated a section of land to build a new Greater Boston Academy because they were outgrowing their spot down in Boston, and parking was horrendous down in the big city. So they moved Greater Boston Academy out to the campus of New England Memorial Hospital in Stoneham. But they were supposed to be 10-grade school, and SLA was supposed to regroup and be a 10-grade school. So they'd have the one conference academy. Well, there was a tug of war between the doctors in Stoneham, the ministers in South Lancaster, and the rest of the conference. At the end of the day, neither of the other 2 were going to budge. So when they moved Greater Boston Academy, they continued on as a 12-grade school. When they moved South Lancaster Academy to their own independent neighboring spot, they continued on as a 12-grade school. That was all fine and dandy until 1982-83 school year, and finally Pioneer Valley Academy went kaput. They didn't have enough support, couldn't manage 3 full academies in such a close locale. So that was the first of our schools to close. But the academy continued here, as you can see today. And this building here was built in 1967. A few years prior to that, the Browning School was built right next door. But South Lancaster Academy is still here. AUC is closed now for several years. Pioneer Valley closed in '83. Sadly, Greater Boston Academy closed a few years ago too. They're down to just the 8th grade program at Edgewood. So you're the last of the Mohicans here. Still going, praise the Lord. We're still going. Here's an early artist rendition of the Founders Hall, then called the Academy Hall, from one of the early bulletins in the 1890s. This was our first principal at SLA, a gentleman named Professor Goodloe Harper Bell. He had been a student of Oberlin College out in Ohio, a very famous forward-thinking college, one of the first co-educational schools in the country for a college. And he had been sick, and he heard about Battle Creek Sanitarium. The Adventists had a very popular sanitarium out there under Dr. Kellogg's tutelage, and he went there for his illness and for treatment. While he was there, he became a Seventh-day Adventist.
Amen.
He became healed, and he says, wow, these guys have something good. And he studied with them, and he converted. Well, he had already been a very good educator, and he was keen on education. So he took those skills and passions with him into the denomination, and he helped start the very first official Seventh-day Adventist school out at Battle Creek in 1874. So this was who we had for our first principal here. He was the top-notch dynamo for Adventist education of the day, and he came out here to be our principal when the school began. He was only here a very short while, about a year and a half, and then he felt called back to Michigan. And I think there was a little strain between him and some of the locals on some of their policy decisions. But they left on friendly terms. And the next person who came after him stayed several years as well. But this man was the very first principal, Goodloe Harper Bell. He wrote some of the earliest Sabbath school lesson studies for the youth in the 1870s. He wrote some of the earliest school educational books for the Adventist schools, and his pioneer work in encouraging local churches to start their own church schools. So he was no small potato in Adventist circles of education. Here we have the Academy Hall again, more pictures of the Academy Hall. Now, the same year that they built this building, Academy Hall, now called Founders Hall, they also built a dormitory. The dormitory was originally, I believe, the east wing, and it was just one of these wings. If it wasn't east, then it was west, but I think it was the east one first. And a few years later, they decided they needed more space, so they did a mirror image with another wing, and they put down in the middle quarters for the deans, housing for the deans, the boys' dean on one level, the girls' dean on another level. And the main lobby there in the first floor, and then the ground floor, the basement floor, was the cafeteria. So this served the South Lancaster Academy students many years, up until the 50s and 60s.
I lived in there.
Oh, look, he lived there. We have a living, breathing specimen of a dorm student. How about that?
West Home.
West Home, yes. I saw another hand in the back.
I lived there
You lived there, too.
2 years.
Anybody else live there? No, there's 3 of you here. We're going to have you stuffed and mounted, put in the corner here. Oh, that's good. So you have a lot of fond memories. This was the family home for the students for decades. Sadly, it fell into ill repair and had a fire, and by the early 1970s, it was torn down. There was an empty lot there when I was a little boy. And then in 1995, they broke ground to build the Chan Shan Dining Commons, which stands there today along Prescott Street. But that's what had been there originally. And there's a sketch of it. This is one of the interior views. I believe that's one of the rooms, or is that a lobby area?
Did it look like that, Linda? No.
This is a view from about 1900, so I think it was ahead of their time a bit. Now, up on the corner of Prescott Street and Main Street was another house that was called the Cilley House. Cilley, C-I-L-L-E-Y was the last name of the family. And the academy ended up buying that because they needed more space, and some of the students and staff lived there for a while. And I still haven't figured out what happened, if they moved it or it got torn down, but I haven't been able to figure out whatever happened to that house. But that was up on the corner of Prescott Street, the northern side, and Main Street. And here we have an early faculty picture from 1887 to 88. The woman to the left in the front row is of particular notoriety. That's Sarah Jane Hall. She came here, again, under the influence of Bell, Goodloe Harper Bell, who she had known out in Battle Creek. She and her husband Reuben came out from there. And she began teaching in 1884, and she taught 26 years until she died in 1910. And she became a very keen friend and a mother figure to many students and even the younger faculty. And she taught English and several other things. But Sarah Jane Hall was quite a fixture at South Lancaster Academy for decades and was well loved, did a great job teaching. Here's another photograph of her by herself, portrait photo. Now, what we have here is our first graduating class of South Lancaster Academy. The school opened in 1882. They got their new building in 1884. And it wasn't until 1888 that they finally mustered enough credits and students and consistency to have a full-blown diploma graduation. Now, if you look in the display cases I set up out there last summer and spring, you'll notice there's original programs for the 1888 graduation. It says second commencement. And there's some other ones that say first commencement, 1887. Well, the reason for that is the 1887 commencement classes were for certificate program students, not full-blown high school diplomas or other diplomas. So the first diploma graduates were 1888, and that's considered the first graduating class for SLA and AUC both. And here we have the four young ladies. The woman to the right is a young woman that came down from northern Vermont by the name of Rowena Purdon. Rowena Purdon graduated in that first class with her three colleagues. There's Ella to her left, Ella Graham, whose house used to stand approximately where Browning building is now. Browning School was the Graham home. And her father, William Graham, was an active, prominent Adventist in the community here, Seventh-day Adventist. And there's also Ella, Ella Graham and Sadie Snyder. And I'm not sure, I haven't been able to figure out, I've seen some references to Ella and Sadie Graham as being sisters and some saying they're cousins. I got to sort that on Ancestry.com. But they were related nonetheless. These were the four first graduates of SLA. Rowena went on back to some more school, got some college degree training, and came back and taught at SLA. And she taught here for years. And in 1918, when the school grew into what was called Lancaster Junior College, continuing South Lancaster Academy for the secondary, but also branching out to a junior college level, she was here. And in 1922, when it became Atlantic Union College as well, she was here, and they gave her one of the very first diplomas. She graduated, first graduate of Atlantic Union College. She worked here for decades, tirelessly, never married. And she poured her heart and soul into this school and into Atlantic Union College.
Her house is still there.
Oh yeah, Miss Purdon's house.
Behind the girls' dorm there.
Yes. Well, no, that was Mrs. Kilgore was there. I don't know if Miss Purdon was in that one. I think that was Miss Kilgore's house you're thinking of.
She was there when I was here.
Okay.
She was,
Well, she died in 1950. Oh, I got to remember. I'm going to cheat. 54. I cheated. So she died in 1954. And 2 years later, she had been working on a school history. She wrote the first history of SLA and Atlantic Union College, because it had grown into that. And it was published after her death, but it's called That New England School, and it's a dandy. It's that red-covered book right here. I'll tell you what, it's a good read for any SLA, AUC alumnus. Very inspiring. But she remained here her whole life and dedicated her energy and activities to the Lord in the form of education. She was the head librarian, and she taught English, especially in the lower levels for SLA, but she did some work with college too. In 1938, when we had the 50th reunion of the first graduating class of 1888, only 2 of those 4 girls were still living. We have on the left Miss Purdon, and on the right Ella Graham Gilbert. In the middle was their principal, Dr. Ramsey, was still alive. He was, I think, the 3rd principal or 4th principal at SLA. There was Bell, and then there was Dolores Robinson, Cavaness, Ramsey, I forget the exact orders. But he was still alive, and he joined them for the 50th anniversary here in 1938. Ella Gilbert Graham, she ended up marrying a graduate of SLA from 1894, a gentleman by the name of F.C. Gilbert. He had been a Jewish convert to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he came to SLA. And of course, SLA then was not just academy, but also pseudo-college, even though they hadn't formed their own college, where they had post-secondary certificate programs too. But he graduated in 1894, and he went on to teach for many years at SLA in the early years, especially Bible languages and Old Testament, because he was Hebrew, he was Jewish, he knew a lot about it. It was his heritage. Very educated man, very diligent teacher. and he ended up marrying Ella Gilbert. And they had a daughter called Miriam Gilbert, who married one of the Timesons. Remember Bill Timeson? Either his uncle or his granduncle was the husband of Miriam. So Lancaster in the 1890s was, South Lancaster was a little bustling area. They had a trolley, as you can see in the background. They had dirt roads still, and bicycles were being used, as well as horse carts. In the background, you can see a wagon. But this is about what the place looked like in the 1890s. This is right out on Main Street across from the women's dorm at AUC, and that's Boynton Road to the right going down there. There's a granite watering trough that's still there in the corner, and the second house, or the house on the left, is the Howe's house, the South Lancaster Fire Department, if that helps you place the picture. And they had the trolley, so a lot of students would come here to the boarding school, and when they came in the fall, they would either arrive on the train or the trolley if they didn't live right in the community already. And the Thayer station, the South Lancaster station, served many a student at SLA in their transport to and from the school for the school year. Here we have a group in 1893 in front of the Founders Hall, Academy Hall, faculty and students both. It's a little tricky from this angle to see, but Miss Hall is in there. I think that's George Cavanis with the beard on the left. He was the principal at that time. And we have an early baseball team from 1894. Now, when the students were here in the 1890s, things were doing fairly well. They had a little boom. They decided to build another dormitory, which we'll get to in a minute. But the students were needing something, and that was work. They had the dairy, the farm. Some of them may have worked housekeeping in the dorm, maybe a student reader with some of the professors, but they needed some industry. And one of the Bible teachers who came out here in the 1890s from upstate New York by the name of Edgar Miles, E. Edgar Miles, he taught Bible, and he got somehow the inspiration to start a business, a bindery. And he came up with an idea for something he thought would sell pretty good, and be good for students to work on making. And here's Elder Miles here and his wife. And he started making these little pocket dictionaries in 1893 and 1894. And it wasn't long before 1900, and here's another one of those vest pocket dictionaries, he built a bindery building, and he went from teaching to full-time industry, employing primarily students. So SLA very early, under the encouragement of Sister White, emphasized hearts, hands, and heads. They wanted the students to have a practical education, hands-on training for manual labor. And so he had the bindery company. Because of his industry, many students were able to go to SLA and AUC that could never have afforded to do so otherwise. When the Great Depression came in the 1930s, there were several non-Adventist students that came here. One of them was a young fellow coming up from Connecticut by the name of Oscar Schmidt. He wanted to be a teacher, and he could not afford it. His family did not have that kind of money in the Depression to afford to send him to college. But some of the family and his family relatives here had heard about the school and told him about it. So he came and applied as a non-Adventist. He agreed to go by the rules, and he immediately got enrolled and put in the dorm and started working at the bindery. Well, before it was over, he got converted and he became a Seventh-day Adventist. Amen. And he went on to be a teacher. He taught out Union Springs, New York for a while. Then he came back and accepted a call to return to Atlantic Union College in the 50s, and he became the librarian after Rowena Purdon died. And he held that job until he retired, and he lived to be 99 years old, and he died about, maybe 5 years ago. And up until the school had closed, he still came in volunteering at the library. When I worked there, I got to know him pretty well. He was quite an interesting fellow. And my cousin Anna Sawyer had the same experience. She went here, she came from a Unitarian family, and she converted to Adventism, working at the bindery and going to SLA. She became a school teacher, never married, and taught up to Frontenac Elementary in Union Springs, New York, then came back and retired here to South Lancaster. So that bindery was a powerhouse for many, a student at SLA and also AUC. Here's the old bindery building here. It was torn down in the 1990s, again, when they were making room for the new dining commons, which was across the street, but the town required certain areas for parking. And here's the original building on the right and the addition they built to the left. Up in the top floors of that original building, there was the student home. Elder Miles had some of the even poorer students stay there free that worked for him. He was very generous with the school. Oops, I went the wrong direction. There we go. Here's some of the early bindery workers at some of their machines, assembling and binding the booklets and the little pocket dictionaries. Here's the group on an outing. Now, in this group, you may notice at the bottom it says Grace Hoffman. I believe the woman here in the white, I think that one, was Grace Hoffman. When I was a little boy at the village church, she was the dynamo in the kindergarten division especially, and she helped push conference-wide the use of felts for visual aids. And they were making felts. They had a little felt factory going down there, and she was a dynamo, making all, the felts you'd have to tell the Bible stories on the board. So she had worked at the bindery back in the earlier days, 1916, 1917. So she was, I guess, in her 80s when I was remembering her back in the 70s. Here's the dairy. The college and SLA had several dairy buildings, also good for employment of students, and very practical because it helped provide milk for the dormitory and the cafeteria, and also they had vegetables and other things to help, produce to help with the school cafeteria program. Now, as I mentioned, they had a little boom. In 1895, they built a new dormitory. This dormitory was on the corner of Flag Street and Main Street, the northern side of Flag Street. And in 1895, they built this dormitory, and then the economy in the country had a bit of a recession. And by 1897, they didn't really need it because the enrollment had dropped off. They had this big new building, and it was really dragging on them. Well, in 1897, they built that addition on the village church I mentioned for an 1890, for Dr. Kellogg coming with his promotion of the medical missionary work for Battle Creek. Well, they decided soon after he was here to turn it into a sanitarium. So Dr. Kellogg helped them organize, and Dr. Nicola especially, was a local doctor, he and his wife, both medical doctors. They organized in 1899 the Sterling-Lancaster Sanitarium. And it ran in this building, dormitory turned sanitarium, from 1899 until 1902. Here's another photograph of it. Now, the SLA students laid out the brick walkway here going to that original building. Unfortunately, and here's a picture of some of the staff there. I think that's Dr. Nicola on the right or the one on the left. One of them is Dr. Nicola, I believe. And one of them would be his wife, too. And look, we have an African-American nurse or doctor. It's hard for me to tell from this angle if it's a man or a woman. I guess it's a man, but on the staff there also. Again, very forward-thinking here in the medical ministry work. So by 1902, they were having so much success. They were kind of maximum capacity with enrollment for patients, but they were running out of space. And worse yet, it was taxing on their sewage system. They only had a little septic tank in the back, and it was overflowing and stinking up the neighborhood. They were having a lot of difficulty, and they had nowhere to go to expand it. So they were trying to figure out what to do. Well, one of the local wealthy families, the Thayer family, the wife couldn't stand having all these people dressed in their funny outfits doing calisthenics out front, and it was an eyesore to them. She'd be bringing her wealthy friends from the train station up to her mansion and going past seeing all this stuff happening on Main Street. Didn't set well with her. So she got her husband to go over there and make an offer. And he offered to buy the place for $50,000, which was like 10 times the value of the place in the day. And the president knew they were having trouble with the finances in the building. They were outgrowing the building. They didn't know what they were going to do. He said yes, because he was afraid that the man might change his mind. That was big money. Well, he didn't have authorization to sell it, but he quickly assembled the board and had a meeting, an emergency meeting, and thankfully they backed him. So they sold the building to Colonel John E. Thayer for $50,000. He was kind, though. He was certainly sympathetic to their work. He said, listen, I know a place down near Boston. The hotel just burned, and they might make it into part of the aquifer for the community water supply down there, Spot Pond. But he said, I think if you went and made an offer, you could get it pretty low, And I'll give you the building here. You can take it apart and use the lumber to fix up the hotel. And you can move it on my train free. He owned the train company. So they did. They tore that building down. They packed it up on the Mr. Thayer's train cars and moved it down to Stoneham, where they bought that property, Langwood Hotel, near Melrose, but in Stoneham. And they used the lumber. They repurposed it. They were ahead of their time repurposing. And fixed that hotel up and made it the New England Sanitarium. So that work continued until 1999, a full 100 years, and finally, sadly, it went bankrupt. Another sad story. But it had its origins here in South Lancaster with South Lancaster Academy. That's what's there today. Colonel Thayer built a museum building for his bird collection. It was the Thayer Bird Museum. Now, interestingly enough, when that petered out in the 1970s, the family was under trust, and the family and all decided to give the collection to Harvard University, which they still have Colonel Thayer's collection, one of the best collections of North American birds, specimens and eggs and nests in the country. And they thought, well, we're going to sell the building. So guess what? They approached Atlanta Community College and sold it back to them for approximately what they had paid for it back in 1902, $50,000. Isn't that funny? So it became the Bartlett Art Gallery for AUC for many years. It served as an art gallery. Here we have some SLA bicyclists in 1905, and the fellow in the back left with the little bow tie on, this is him here, Osbert Ward. He was in the class of 1906. When they had the 100th anniversary of SLA in 1982, he was still alive at 105. He was the oldest alumnus.
Wow.
And here we have inside one of the faculty apartments in probably East or West Hall. And we have President Malcolm and Macklin on the back left and his secretary and workers. See this typewriter here? We have a similar typewriter on the display case upstairs that I got out of Haskell Hall this summer from the old business department things. Came from SLA's business department. And we have here a 1911 elementary school group. They were meeting in the Founders Hall, but it was getting too tight. So in 1912, they built the Browning Normal Building right next door with money that came from the Browning family in upstate New York. And the sister wanted it to commemorate her brother, so it was the J.T. Browning Missionary and Industrial Normal School was the full name when it opened back in 1912. And it served the boys and girls of the Adventist community here right up until about that 1965. And they built the new Browning School here, tore this one down, sadly. But this is what the campus mall looked like before that. The Miles Building, built in 1932 for the science department, helped save the school at that time. Then the Browning Building, and then the Academy Hall, later called Founders Hall. Here's the 8th and 7th and 8th graders, 1936. My grandmother's the one tilting her head a little bit there in the back row. She only died 2 years ago. She was 97. Here they are tearing down the old Browning Building around 1965, sadly. What they built there instead was AUC's modern library, the Georg Jones Library. And Oscar Schmidt oversaw the transfer of the books from Haskell Hall to this building. They had a long human chain of students, mostly college, with some SLA students too, and they would pass the books between them all the way over, all day long, until finally the last load of books was being taken off the shelves. They had Oscar hold them, and they carried Oscar the whole way over to the library when they opened the new Georg Jones Library in 1970 or 72. Here's the old Graham House that used to be where the Browning Building is now, and that's what's there today. And here's the boys and girls marching in the 100th anniversary parade by the village church in 1982. And here's the village church again. There's a lot more here. We don't have time for it. I'm told we got to wrap up because it's time for Vespers. Maybe we can have another chat next year and do some more. I don't know. But thank you so much for coming. We have a rich history. I do want to end, this is our SLA sledding party in 1903. They knew how to have fun back then. And the fire brigade. But I did want to end on a quote. Here's 1950 Browning Band. Frank Howe's is in there. If you look carefully, you'll find Frankie Howe's and others. My cousin Will DeHardy's there in the front too.
I'm there too.
Oh my, somebody's there too. Look at that. The blonde in the third row on the left. Oh my, we got to get your autograph. They're in a parade. Here they are, 1960, the Founders Day Parade along Prescott Street. You can see Rowell's in the background. The old Lancaster elm that blew over in 1907, a favorite spot for the picnickers at SLA and elsewhere. It was 27 feet in circumference. It blew down in 1907. But remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, and they will tell thee. Again, we have biblical encouragement for such things. And there's one last quote, going through the camp meeting pictures real quick, but here we go. Sister White tells us, in reviewing our past history, having traveled over every step of advance to our present standing, I can say, praise God. As I see what the Lord has wrought, I am filled with astonishment and with confidence in Christ as leader. We have nothing to fear for the future except as we shall forget the way the Lord led us and His teaching in our past history. Friends, we need to reconnect with our roots.
Yes.
We need to support our schools and our work. Thank you for your time. God bless.